Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Auto Remarketing Podcast. My name is Joe Overby, Senior Editor of Auto Remarketing. And joining me today is one of our inaugural honorees in Cherokee Media Group's Automotive Intelligence Award. And he's a familiar face and a familiar name to many of you. That is Jonathan Smoke, who is the Chief Economist at Cox Automotive. Jonathan is among just a handful of folks that we are recognizing this spring for their contribution to the knowledge base of the used car retail, finance, and marketing industry. And Jonathan, man, you're the go-to resource for all things automotive and also music. And we'll get into that a bit later. But man, it's good to talk with you. Congrats on the award, and thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me, and it's an honor to be one of your award recipients. Since it's quite a group you've assembled, so I'm glad I can be a part of that.
Absolutely. Well, we talked a while back when you first started with Cox Automotive, and sort of about you coming from the real estate side market into the automotive market. But I guess for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with that whole story, how did you get into just the analytical and economist realm in the first place, and how did you make your way into and eventually automotive?
Yeah, it was not a straight path, and one that I can't say that anybody could necessarily plan. But it's worked out wonderfully for me. I did study economics in undergraduate and really loved it. It was something that I didn't take in high school, but the second I think my very first class in college was Economics 101, and I was hooked at the beginning because it appealed to me in both offering theory to explain why people do what they do, as well as being, pushing statistics and looking for data to prove relationships, especially, on the macro side of things in econometrics. But when I graduated, I basically thought that the only path for an economist was to be in a professor and to teach, and I wanted to get out there in the world and do things. So I avoided any thought of getting a graduate degree in economics, and eventually I decided to get an MBA, and I went into management consulting. And happened to come out, right when the internet was becoming a thing in the early 90s. And basically, anybody who had gotten an MBA or a master's degree related to technology was suddenly in demand everywhere to make sense out of the revolution that was happening with data and technology. But I found myself in real estate. In consulting, it's sort of a, luck of the draw. What's the first project you get assigned to occasionally? And I happened to land on a project with a home building company, and there began the journey that eventually actually had me, after 6 years in consulting, going to work in real estate, and then actually at a home building client that had been that I had worked quite a bit with, and I worked as sort of in every part of the company, just that was in massive growth mode, and eventually ended up having the title of being responsible for strategy. And in home building, your decisions that you make about the investments in land and where you're going to choose to operate are really hard to overcome if you make a mistake.
Yeah.
And so economics made a lot of sense to really be applied rigorously to where we should invest, what kind of product we should develop. And I set out on a quest, and that's now been 30 years ago, to build out data to help drive decision making, first in real estate, and then I've had the opportunity with Cox to change industries and do that in automotive. But along the way, we discovered that what I was doing was more about acting as an economist, and so it's been, I think, now 14 years that I've had the title of chief economist at three different places. But automotive was a unique situation to be able to come to Cox and create a team that was going to have access to this incredible data. I loved real estate. I felt like, I really understood the dynamics of especially residential real estate in the US, but I had also done it for over 20 years, and automotive seemed like something that could challenge me, but at the same time use what I had learned in real estate and apply it to automotive, because I felt like there were parallels, and that was absolutely the case. And I joked, of course, since I've been pulling music into what I do for the last 15 years. I joked that the songs about cars are just way better than the songs about houses. So it was a much
Yeah,
fertile playing field for that.
there's really no. I mean, there's a lot of songs, I guess, about houses, but the ones about cars kind of come to mind quicker, and I guess because
Oh
maybe they
yeah,
resonate with people more. They're more romantic about that. But
most of the songs about houses are sad.
yes, exactly. Yeah,
maybe
just think of
maybe
the ones
Flo
that come to
Rida is
mind.
about the only one that can do a good one about
Yeah.
my house.
Well, so since you've been in the chief economist role with Cox Automotive now for several years, what does a typical day or week look like for you? What is it, if there is such a thing as a typical day?
Yeah, I would immediately say there is no such thing as a typical day. There is some regularity, because part of the job is dealing with data, and we produce data. That's a huge part of what I'm responsible for, and the team that I have here is responsible for, starting like with the history and legacy of the Mannheim Index, and then leading to all the other things that we have added to the plate. So, Mondays of every week, we're combing through what happened over the weekend and what officially was a part of the prior week. The first of the month always has the data for the prior month. The 16th of the month is when we get the data for the first half of the month. So there's things that get defined on the calendar that's purely based on the calendar itself, and our data sources across Cox. But then we also look at what's happening in the broader economy, and so there's the calendar of data points in any given week. The first Friday of the month is traditionally when the employment report comes out, and CPI is usually around the 10th. And there's just for those of us that are playing in the economics world, our lives just sort of naturally revolve around what government market moving data releases are happening this week. To pay attention to those things and the connections that they have in the auto market. But outside of that, I would say everything else is really responding to what's happening within the industry. So when you have events, when things like NADA or NAAA Used Car Week are going on, then usually that involves trying to be a part of that, or someone from the team being a part of that. So the work always involves travel. And then I try to spend probably at least a third of my time meeting with clients on a regular basis, and that can be phone calls and virtual visits, one on one with a single decision maker, but it also can be standing in front of all the GMs for a publicly traded company, which I did that very thing just 2 days ago. This week, and it's all of those things that make this job what it is, because you need the data to have insights, but you really need to be talking people to make sense out of it all. What I think intelligence is, and I don't know if we're going to get into that, but it's ultimately about helping people make good decisions. That's what I've always been driven by doing, whether I was in consulting or acting as a quote unquote chief economist. And how can you do that if you're not in front of people and helping them understand, make sense of the world? And I happen to have, over the course of my career, gone through some major cycles in the economy and unique things happening. And so as a result, I always feel like there's something new to learn and build upon. So that probably would be another reason why no 2 days are alike, because even if you took the same day of the week, same week in the month, same month on the calendar, it's just not going to be the same.
So, your title might say economist, but, you're in some ways you're a spokesperson, you're a advisor, you're a manager to your team. I mean, it's lots of different jobs within one overall job of being chief economist. But you mentioned just the way you guys go about getting data and sort of the stuff you pay attention to. Obviously, I see it in your analyses and reports. And you mentioned it earlier. The things you get from you know different federal bodies of data, federal bodies that send in data, Federal Reserve, et cetera. And then there's also the data, as you mentioned, that you collect and sort of produce yourselves. How do you guys, I mean, without giving away the secret sauce, how do you guys go about getting data from the industry to say, this is Cox Automotive data that indicates, there were X amount of used car sales or used car prices, et cetera?
Well, first, we try to make the most out of data that we have that
Hmm.
especially can inform. So there was a legacy that I inherited coming into Cox, which was the Mannheim Index, that had been first created in the late 90s to give the industry a way to understand what direction are used vehicle values going. And in my time, it's now been 8 years. We have substantially expanded that. We went from doing one data point a month to 2 data points a month. During the pandemic, we were basically reporting what was happening daily, in some cases, for clients, because their sales every day, and you can track underlying metrics. The way that valuations exist from Kelley Blue Book and Mannheim MMR, there are numbers that you can share daily, and of course get into the segments and makes and models and all the glorious details that are this industry. Then on the sales side, we have platforms that give us visibility into a deep set of finance credit transactions related to auto loans. But to make sense out of the total universe of what's going on, we need to work with third-party data. So we work with the best in the business from a registrations perspective. We work with both S&P and Experian. That data gives us full visibility into the total market, but it comes with a lag. So part of the job is, a little bit art as well as science of taking what we know is not 100% of the transactions that are going on, but things that we have good representation in our platforms, or what we can see happening in the various software products that Cox has dealers operating. And as a result, we can typically piece things together and give people direction on what's happening. And then, well, what else? Third party data. Obviously, on the credit side, we also, in addition to Experian, work with Equifax to pay attention to loan performance, because that plays such a big role in terms of the interest rates that consumers are spending, and that controls affordability and demand characteristics. But it also heavily influences what might be coming back into the wholesale market from a remarketing perspective with repossessions and lease returns, and the like. And then, of course, there's the science of being an economist. We've got some smart people, but we want to be aligned with the smartest economists that are in this trade and predicting what GDP is going to be and what the unemployment rate and inflation rate is going to be. So we work with great organizations like Moody's Analytics and Oxford Economics, because we're better when we have the perspective of people like that, backing us up. And what I've learned in this is when you start and you have a strong base in something like valuations at Manheim, if you partner with other people, you can improve upon what you're seeing, and you can collaborate. So, we several of your other award recipients are people that I see on a regular basis and interact with, and even for those that might be somewhat competitors, we live in a universe where our perspectives, that we each pay attention to what everyone is saying, because we all have unique platforms or parts of the market that we operate in, and we're all better off understanding what each person does. And I think that fits the auto market in particular very well, because this is a market with lots of competition, but it's also a market that cares about the industry itself and wants to move things along. And you guys actually, and I remember your very first auto intelligence summit, and trying to move the industry in this direction, I think is a good representation of look, it takes a village of us to make sense, especially when we go through crazy times.
Yeah.
And that's another thing about the day in the life of a chief economist of an auto company. It looks like we have no shortage of interesting times to continue to live through.
Well, I think you said 8 years you've been with Cox Automotive. There's certainly been some just interesting dynamics, just from a geopolitical to, I don't even know what you would call medical,
Yeah. Global pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, pandemic. Yeah. It's been kind of a wild ride, but so you mentioned, the data you collect from various sources when it comes to putting pen to paper, so to speak, whether you and your team are getting ready to write the week's data point report, or you're getting ready to do a video that you put on the press room website, or you're doing a presentation to a client or a trade group. How do you sort of make sense of it all, and put it in layman's terms so that folks like me can understand it?
Well, one, I feel like we're always in that mode.
Yeah.
Because literally certainly every day, and almost to an extent of every hour, especially during the business day, and we have a president that likes to tweet, executive orders and the like. There are new data points that you have to take into account, and how does that influence your perspective? So no two presentations, no two reports are ever alike.
Yeah.
And going back to the analogy of thinking about the day in the life and how the calendar itself sort of influences some things. Um, I feel like I'm always writing. I'm always thinking about interpreting what this morning's home sales report. What is it reflecting, and what does it mean? Does it change any of the perspective that we have about the forecast? Consumer sentiment came out at 10 a.m. What does that consistent with what we had been seeing, or does it change a view? So you're always sort of hearing, ingesting, responding, and prepared to be able to speak to whatever is happening. So it's certainly not rote. I can think that there were probably times in history when there was very little change from one data point to another, but we've not been living in those kinds of times. And nor do I think we're sort of destined to be in a very calm and stable time for the next several years, just because of the unique circumstances of changes going on in the economy, and changes going on in politics, and changes going on, in the very structure of the auto market and the product that we produce and sell, and all of those kinds of things. So um, it's certainly not a job for somebody that likes regularity of the same thing every day, exactly the same way. Um, and so it attracts people, I guess, that are just naturally curious. And I also think that there's an element, especially when you go through things like the Great Recession. I was in housing when housing
Oh
imploded. Um,
gosh.
and then, to be a part of the auto market and the economy when, the world shut down in March of 2020, and then we ran into all the supply chain issues. You have to have an element of intellectual humility that you don't know, and that all the experts in the world, even if you had access to all of them, they don't know what is going to happen next, because these things have never all come together in exactly the same way. And no matter what data you have, even the people at Cox Automotive or JD Power, who other people might be saying, well, they've got everything you possibly need to figure out what's happening in the world. The answer is no, we never have enough data to be able to figure out exactly what happens next. And so it's fun to always think that, well, okay, if your job is to help people make decisions, then you've got to have the best data, but you've also got to be on your toes, trying to figure out what's around the next corner that I'm not taking into account, that might be influencing these trends we're seeing. And so it keeps you young, I think, which is also a good reason to pay attention to music.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it's having interviewed both, musicians lately and economists, and being a journalist, there's a little bit of similarities between just the constant writing process through all those different fields. I mean, you're constantly observing and writing, and whether you're writing a song, whether you're writing an economic report, whether you're writing a news story, just seems like you're always constantly writing down observations and then eventually cobbling it together into something that makes sense. Um, but along those lines, it is well documented that you moonlight as a DJ as well. So you mentioned you pay attention to music. So what are some of the under the radar artists that are kind of resonating with you these days?
I'm trying to think of if there's somebody under the radar. To me, I've sort of gone through a bit of a desert in the last couple of years. I've kind of felt like TikTok killed the music business for a while, and that probably also squarely puts me at over 50, and kind of getting too old. But I'm enjoying, this month has had the Grammys, and there's
Mhm.
always a little bit of traction at the Grammys. And I gotta say, that Grammys was the most entertaining that I've seen in a long time. I'm really encouraged by seeing Lady Gaga back and doing like stuff in her lane, because I'm digging what she's been doing lately. Even like some of the new artists that I had really not been that familiar with, and until the Grammys were pretty impressive to me this year. So I've been listening to them quite a bit. And I don't know, there's a group, the Yeah Yeahs, that have been around for quite a while, and for some reason they keep hitting my rotation in Spotify, because I'll leave music on, and once you get to the end of the playlist, Spotify starts guessing what you want
Yeah.
to listen to. And so I'm like, wait a minute, I like that. What is that that's playing right now? And I have to go find where my phone is and see what it's telling me the artist actually is.
Yeah, I think that's it's been one of the music discovery, for better or worse, you know the digitization of music through Spotify and Apple Music, and back in the day, Pandora. Um,
Yep.
it might hurt record sales, but it also introduces you to a lot more people that you wouldn't necessarily know from just physical media or the radio. Um, but yeah, I always enjoy. One of the things I always enjoy is in the quarterly Mannheim Index calls you do, or it's either that or
Yeah,
the
our
quarterly,
quarterly main webinar for,
yeah,
yeah.
where you do the 10 songs that kind of reflect the market right now. I think that's just creative use of both your talents there, in terms of forecasting and DJing. But Jonathan, it is always a pleasure to talk with you, and we'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining the show, and congrats again on being one of our inaugural Auto Intel Intelligence Awards.
Well, thank you, Joe.
Absolutely. Well, that'll do it for today's edition of the Auto Remarketing Podcast. My thanks to Jonathan Smoke and the folks at Cox Automotive, and thanks to you for listening.